Welcome to France, Paris, Montmartre, home of Sacré-Cœur and This Little Train, and one of the most uplifting films ever made, Jean-Pierre Jeunet's Amelie. A film about life's little pleasures, ripping wallpaper off walls, dipping your hand most unhygienically in a sack of grain, the little oyster from the centre of a chicken. A film about finding joy in helping others, reuniting grown men with childhood treasures, fabricating final letters of adoration from long-lost lovers, or putting a quirky, spontaneous spark back into a father's stagnated life.
Je ne comprends pas.
In fact, in many ways, Amelie should be far too happy to work. Sure, there's deep-seated grief in its backstory, really awful tragedy, like the collateral death of her mother by someone committing suicide, or her father's misdiagnosis of a heart condition condemning her to homeschooling, when really her little heart only fluttered because it was the only personal attention he ever gave her. And yet, there's a light-hearted ridiculousness to all this sadness, a humour which numbs the pain and leaves only the whimsy, or so we think. It should be sickly, like excessive consumption of candies, or kids' TV after discovering the overwhelming sorrow of the real world. Amelie should be too sweet to stomach, but it isn't. Why? I risked death by happiness watching and re-watching, looking for clues, and eventually found a hint of an answer, staring, literally, straight back at me. After 1 hour of seemingly detached narrative, Amelie breaks the fourth wall and stares straight back at the camera. She knows we're watching. This isn't the first time she does this. In fact, Amelie is completely aware of the camera in the opening sequence in which characters are introduced, but once the story gets underway, 14 minutes in, we see no more of it and assume the introduction is over and the story, a separate film in a way, has begun. Nope, they're the same. Just as in the opening, Amelie, and only Amelie, is aware of the film. She is telling this story herself, the way she sees it, the way she feels it. She has been doing all along. It's subjective. It's much easier to accept sweetness, to swallow overwhelming joviality when it's coming from an actual person. We don't have to believe it's exactly what happened, only that it's how they recall it, how they feel about it, and thus how they tell it. In conversation, this is a key part of how we interpret a story and come to feel about it ourselves. It's okay to laugh about the bizarre nature of Amelie's mother's death because she, i.e. the film, is telling the story in a funny way. And equally, it's okay to share her sunny view of everything else because, simply, c'est juste ça. It's her view. The mark of Amelie's own imagination and retelling of the truth are everywhere. Another aspect of the film touching on sickliness for its overstatement is its palette. Strong reds and greens, together a very festive and cosy arrangement, but also offering opposing themes of love and envy, warmth and coldness, loyalty and mischief, belonging and isolation. All of Amelie's emotions painted haphazardly onto the canvas of this, her film, in her own carefree, childlike manner. Remember that, childlike. Beyond colour, the film is turned up to 11 in other regards, be it soundtrack, cinematography, circumstance, or characterisation. These seemingly supplementary pieces of the film's quirky world are in reality Amelie's personal touch from her quirky world view. The same as all the likes and dislikes that establish characters, over-embellished side stories that fill in narrative spaces, little joys and curiosities, it's all Amelie's subjectivity. But what can we learn about Amelie from the way she tells this story? It's time to unravel Jeunet's handiwork and uncover the ghostwriter who's passed us this story through. Do you mind? Childhood. Why is Amelie telling her story, even the horribly sad bits, with the playful attitude of a child? Because she never grew up. She never got the chance to, kept locked indoors. Now we see the facetious manner in which she recites her childhood is a demonstration of Amelie's own coping mechanism. Her desperation to cover up the horrific sorrow of her mother's death and her father's solitude with little hundreds and thousands of joy. She's still at it as an adult, trying to coat over her grief with the vicarious pleasure of becoming everyone else's guardian angel. But as becomes obvious, this isn't going to work. She's not beating her grief by covering it up. And she's not fixing her solitude, her deep-rooted isolation, by laying booby traps of joy in others' wake, watching it from afar through panes of glass. Amelie, ever the director's inventive personal storyteller, lets us onto her realisation of this with a spoof French TV obituary. The glass man himself, painting an allegorical Amelie, is onto her too, tapping at the glass at the edge of a delicate soul. He will eventually prove the final push Amelie needs, tragically because he knows what eternal isolation looks like. Him. But which glass, I hear you ask? This glass. The window in Amelie's home she stares out of from her sad, lonely, unloved childhood. Glass panes, agonisingly transparent yet physically impassable, communicate Amelie's isolation, her longing gaze outside her own psyche, her desire yet inability to connect with another human being, to feel in herself the joy of affection for the first time in her life. These panes of pain, usually but not necessarily always glass, are omnipresent in the film. They form its core theme. Not merely Amelie, but her widower father, the glass man, the bloke in the photo booth printouts. All of them are visible but socially unavailable, and the message of the film is that for its characters, lost souls, or souls, floating around modern Paris by fleeting association after fleeting association, finally breaking this veil and discovering the soft human being underneath, you could say like the cracking through the coating of a creme brulee, is a moment of absolute, unbridled euphoria. Too much for Amelie with all her story work to communicate without Jeunet using similarly unbridled camera movement or carefully placed CGI. Exhibit A, the blind man she takes for a walk down the street, describing everything to him, metaphorically opening his eyes, breaking the barrier of blindness that isolates him. This feeling of ecstasy is not red or green, but orange. Amelie's fish wasn't suicidal, it was trying to break out of its emotional fishbowl, and it made it. Yay! Why choose glass? Well, if your metaphor were much more subtle, all you'd be left with is the actor's emotion, and there's very little separating the outward appearance of internal isolation from that of just indistinct sadness, or meh. However, making the isolation more overt, or more aptly more opaque, would result in Amelie having nothing to look out through longingly. Isolation more accurately looks like this, but this isn't very interesting, nor is it likely to sprint around Paris on a quest of positivity. The film gives us proof of that. Amelie's own panes of glass are often conspicuous, for us and for her, but sometimes they aren't. Allegorical Amelie is trapped in a painting and hiding behind a glass of water. Water is used again at Canal Saint-Martin. You can't get here. I tried. Where Amelie desperately tries to shatter her barrier, skimming against its stones of joy that she picks up on her quest of positivity. It won't work. The key to Amelie's restitution is in being loved, and where self-constructed pains of isolation are concerned, this is just as much a task of willing to feel loved, of destroying the pains, and equally letting someone destroy them with you. Enter Nino, whose adorable love story with Amelie is another fairy tale made more plausible by understanding its subjective retelling. It doesn't matter whether they did actually reflect sunlight at each other as lonely kids or not, only that in saying they did, Amelie deems their crossing of paths to have been fated long ago. Sent on a romantic wild goose chase, Nino, himself chasing the solution to his isolation, suitably responds to Amelie's longing, knocking at her window. Oh no. The meat of the film, its main story, is this, not the quest to return Brotteaux's box, as we're led to believe. That's achieved 1/3 through. It's a battle. Each time these characters come achingly closer to each other, the barrier either reappears or is put back up through fear. Nino is put through the frustration of staring through these windows, ghouling through these costumes, listening through these phones, running up the hill to Sacré-Cœur, and it's a big hill, only to achingly stare at his lover through the glass lens of a telescope. But rest assured, he is slowly getting there. And Amelie is fighting her own fight. She's coming to terms with the fact that merely vicarious pleasure isn't enough to fulfill her own happiness. She can't pull the strings of her own joy. She has to let it happen to her. Nino Campoir isn't going to pick up your baking ingredients from Colignon's, run up the stairs out of the rain and teasingly tickle the beads across the doorway. As much as she wants it to be, that isn't how her emotional threshold will be crossed. To let someone into your eager, fervent little heart, you have to let the story happen beyond your control. I'm taking poetic liberty here because this is the most emotional part of the film for me, but yes, the casting of Audrey Tautou was also no accidental genius. Very few people have such huge, glossy eyes, such glass-like windows to the soul. And when that barrier is what your entire film rests on, you need to find a really good example. The window is cracking. The door is unlocked. And as if we needed any more proof that they're meant to be, Nino is already right behind it. There's two ways to make sure an audience can stomach a sweet, sugary film. The first is to make sure that sugar coats something more tart, and the second is to tell it with all the emotion and imagination and subjectivity left in. Jeunet's great achievement is handing his story to his main character to tell herself and weaving her embellishments subtly into the film, allowing us to feel hugely and wholesomely happy. I hope I've pointed that out well enough, but if not, there's one more touch. As the couple dart about Montmartre, the reds and greens have matured to the orange that denotes wholesome organic happiness, and the incredibly catchy motif of the soundtrack returns, only this time for the first and only time there's a percussion behind it, a beating rhythm. Amelie, has finally found her heartbeat.